The Girl of Ink and Stars, Chapter 3. The carriage stopped just outside the school. The driver jumped down to open the door as Governor Adori swept aside the curtains and stepped down into the dust. I shrank back, standing in Lupe's shadow. This close he was shorter than I expected, but wide-shouldered, his chest round as a barrel. I'd never met him before, seen him only on his horse in the annual parade, where the whole village was made to come out and cheer. The governor's men even handed out blue banners to wave and fined people if they got the cloth dirty. I wondered if he knew Lupe was friends with the cartographer's daughter. "Come now," he said to Lupe. She looked uncertainly at me. I released her hand. "Papa, what's—" "No questions. Get inside." "Can Isabella come?" I ducked my head as he peered past her. "No," he said. "We're going home." "Can we drop her in the village then?" said Lupe uncertainly. I knew she was not allowed to invite people over. The governor clicked his tongue, then snapped his fingers in my direction. "Hurry up." Signora Felice tripped alongside us. Sorry, Governor Adori, I did send someone ahead, but the girls had got across the fields." The teacher fell silent as the governor held up his hand impatiently. He motioned for us to get in the carriage. My legs shook as I climbed up into the soft interior and sat opposite Signora Adori. She shifted her skirts away from my dusty sandals. Her lips were pursed, and she was even paler than usual, her blue silk fan flicking impatiently around her face. Dar said she came from Europa, and she certainly dressed as if she did. Despite the heat, she was wearing a full-skirted blue silk dress, and a bead of sweat was snaking its way down her cheek. She did not move to wipe it away. We set off. It was my first time in a carriage, but it was hard to feel excited. Why was school closed? And why had the governor come to pick Lupe up? We never had before. I chanced to look at him. He was imposing in the cramped space of the carriage. His skin darker than Lupe's, dark as Dar's. His eyes were narrow, pupils black and slatted as a snake's and just as cold. As I watched, a yellow dragonfly flickered briefly at his temple, and he caught it mid-flight, crushing it between two fingers and dropping it to the carpeted floor. I shuddered. Why had he come here? Why did he treat Gioia as if it belonged to him and not to the people who'd lived here for centuries? Because of him, I had never seen the rest of our island, let alone the world, and Dar's skills as a map maker were wasted. Because of him, there were no more songbirds. Masha said he was to blame for the river drying up, but Dar said she was just being superstitious. It was stuffy and hot. The velvet of the seats stuck to my legs, and I longed to throw back the curtain and see what was happening outside. But I kept my eyes fixed on a ring of keys glinting from his belt. Lupe seemed uncomfortable too. "What's going on, Papa?" The governor's hand clenched and unclenched. "Mama will explain when we get home." His eyes flicked again to me. "Is it something bad?" He gave a hollow laugh, like a low, tuneless bell. Fear spiked through me. Why could he not explain it now? No one spoke again until the governor barked out, "Stop!" and the horses were pulled to a halt. The carriage rocked as the driver jumped down and opened the door. I drew back the curtain and my skin chilled. We were back in the market square, but it was deserted. All the stalls were closed and empty, apart from the feathery mass of ravens fighting over scraps. I didn't understand. This was usually the busiest time of day, when the villagers did their shopping before the worst of the heat swept Gramira's streets. Governor Adori's voice was low and grim. "Go home, girl. We can't take you any further." "I'll see you at school tomorrow," Lupe said as I went to open the door, a question in her voice. "No school," barked the governor. "Not for a few days at least." A drumbeat started in my chest. I wanted to ask what was happening, but my throat felt packed with sand. The governor's wife again moved her skirts away from my feet. I took care to scuff my sandal on her silk shoe as I climbed down. The governor moved to pull the door closed, but Lupe sprawled out and hugged me hard. "I will try and find out what's happening," she whispered into my neck. "Meet me by the barrel tomorrow at dusk, and don't forget the fireworks." I nodded as the horses were whipped into a trot and she was dropped back into shade behind the curtain. When I reached our house, I could hardly breathe. The door was wide open, and the flower pot by the door was tipped over, spilling earth and daisies. That stopped me short. The panic that had driven me up the hill was now holding me back. "Da!" Nothing. I stepped forward. "Da!" The sunlight sent patterns whirling across my eyes in the gloom. I blinked them to stop. Da was not in the main room. It was the same as when I had left, the bowl of burnt porridge uneaten by its bed of maps. The walls swayed slightly. Because of the maps or my spinning head, I did not know. Only the forest green jug had been moved back onto its shelf. A rustle came from Da's study, and relief filled me like air. That was typical of Da, too busy with work to hear me. He probably wouldn't even know what was going on outside. I crossed to the thick curtain and pulled it aside. "Da!" The shutters were open, letting through a breeze that lightly lifted the papers covering his desk. This must have been what I heard, because his stool was empty. Staining the parchment on the desk was something shiny. Unable to stop myself, I reached out and touched it. It was wet. My fingers were red. I felt the room spooling away, my mind filling with dark. "Each of us carries the map of our lives on our skin." Da's voice. Why was he speaking like that? Cold, slow. "See here how my blood runs not blue at my wrists, but black." And why did I know exactly what he was going to say next? "Your mother always said it was ink. I am a cartographer through to my heart." Da was ahead of me, walking through a dark channel of houses that swayed in the wind like trees. Now they were trees, and Da was stretching his hand towards me, redness flooding his palm. His chest was a bloody mess of skin and feathers, black feathers, like the ravens Pep caught. My heart! I was dreaming. Dream Da was walking towards me, his face blank. I wrenched my chest from the hot ground, pulling myself backwards, away from him, along the stretching line of trees, out of the dream. Something was tugging my hair. Miss La. When I opened my eyes, she was squawking indignantly and began running around in circles. I was on the floor of the study. Pep was sitting in the doorway, regarding me cautiously. But Da, where was he? My heart throbbed as I looked at my fingers, still that deep red stain. I stood slowly. The room tilted and my shoulder ached where I had landed on it. I made my way shakily through the house, checking the kitchen and the garden where Gabo's tebaya bush was just beginning to blossom with starburst blossoms. Miss La and Pep followed, but there was no Da anywhere. At the front, the street was still deserted. I held onto the doorknob as if the ground were an ocean and letting go meant drowning. The drumming in my ears was back, layering over the sound of insects and the ravens that hunted them. "Over here!" The voice made me jump. "Issa, in here!" Masha was peering through a crack in her shutters. I let go of the door and crossed the street, legs shaking. Masha closed the door hurriedly behind me. "What are you doing out there all alone?" The words hushed from my mouth. "It's Da. He's not at home and I can't find him and there's blood." I held out my hand. It shook, though I told it not to. "Issa, breathe." Masha wiped away my tears with her cuff and steered me to a chair. She uncurled my fingers and brought a bowl of warm water from the stove. She began rubbing at the stain with a coarse cloth. The back door was open and a sluggish breeze wafted in from the dirt courtyard. "This isn't blood." Masha's face was scrunched up with concentration. "What? It's not blood. See? See how it won't budge, no matter how hard I scrub it." The stain was still bright red. But what is it? Masha shrugged. Ink, I imagine. But where's Dar? A voice came from the back doorstep. I squinted and made out the shape of a broad back against the brightness. Pablo. I saw him heading towards the market square a while ago, he said. He didn't look injured to me, just scared. His voice was no longer boyish, but deep and cracking slightly at the edges. Masha clucked her tongue. Why didn't you say sooner? I swallowed. Where was he going? I expect you to get you from school after hearing what happened. What has happened? You mean you don't know, said Masha, her voice thin. I shook my head desperately. Masha and Pablo talked at the same time. Maybe we should wait until your dad gets here. They found a body. Pablo! Said Masha sharply. What? She wants to know. She'll find out anyway. You just want to scare her. I won't be scared. I jutted out my chin to show I wasn't crying anymore. You can tell me. Masha threw down the cloth she had been using on my fingers. Pablo hesitated, then stood, stepping forward into the shade. This morning, a girl was found in the orchard, he said at last. Taking my silence for incomprehension, Masha took my hand softly. He means a girl was found dead, killed. The silence unfurled until I forced myself to speak. Who? Masha paused, looking at Pablo. He was so much taller. 2 years had stretched him high as a man. I wondered if Gabo would have grown the same as me, or faster. A girl called Kata Rodriguez. I looked at him for a moment, feeling nothing. Hearing him through the pulse in my ears, I pressed my palm to my forehead to stop the rising flood of questions. Masha took it and held it between her own. Isabella, you need to rest. I opened my mouth to speak, but Masha raised a warning finger. Not one more word. I know you are worried about your father, but he is a clever man and he will be fine. I nodded dumbly. The governor has ordered a curfew until they sort it all out. Curfew? We are to stay inside. Your da is probably stuck somewhere waiting for it to be lifted. He would never forgive me if I let you out of my sight. Not after a murder. A shudder ran through the three of us. I'll go home and I'll wait. I rose, but Masha pressed me firmly back down. You will rest. The old woman stood and pushed past her son to reach the garden. I could see her picking something from a low shrub by the door. Paolo turned towards me. His face was broad, but no longer round, cut in angles across the cheeks and jaw. His eyes were the same dark brown, though. I looked down at my lap, suddenly shy. Masha came back in and filled a cup from the water bucket. Drink this and eat these. She held out 2 small, dark berries. They'll help you sleep. I don't need to. You've had a terrible fright. Have some food and then you can lie down in Pablo's room until your father arrives. He won't know where I am. I'll keep a lookout on the strindo for him. I will not take my eyes off the street. Masha placed the berries on the table, watching as I picked them up and chewed. They sent little bursts of bitterness that made my tongue tingle. After forcing down the bread, I followed Masha to Pablo's room and got into bed. The pillow was soft and the sheets smell of lavender, and as my body filled with heaviness from the berries, my thoughts chased themselves like dogs chasing their tails. Kata, dead. The orchard, dragon fruit, Lupe. Kata, dead.